So welcome to the Wednesday seminar. We should maybe refer to this as Wednesday after Snowmageddon, even though it wasn't maybe as much snow as some of us were fearing. It's really nasty out there. So delighted to see that so many people actually make it in because we're in for a real treat today. I'm just thrilled to welcome Lindsay back to MIT, but back to SSP in particular. He was a staunch member of the program when he did his PhD here. Class of 2011, so it's been a minute, but you're just arguing he hasn't changed one bit. He's going to talk today on a new book, The Age of Deception, Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft. He's currently an associate professor of cybersecurity and privacy in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He looks at emerging technology and global security and kind of all of its domains. So quantum, AI, cyber is all sort of a fair game. And the author of more books that I can probably list here in the time that we have, but incredibly accomplished scholar in the field of security studies. He also previously served with the U.S. Navy on assignments in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. So, Jon, welcome back. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much, Taylor, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak here. It's really an honor to return to the mothership and see some familiar faces and new faces. But the approach from the hotel to here was not familiar. I thought I was in the wrong city with all the new buildings going up. So that was amazing. It's really a pleasure to discuss this book that just came out last year, Age of Deception. And I want to talk a little bit about the cover. Do you like it? I like it. The first thing that I really like about it is that this is a book about cybersecurity that doesn't have any glowing microchips or flying ones and zeros. And I had to argue with Cornell about that a little bit. Secondly, I love this Escher image, right? This is a drawing by M.C. Escher. It's a self-portrait of his own eye looking into a shaving mirror with this ominous symbol of mortality there. And in so many of Escher's work, there are these strange loops, and you find yourself wondering, is the skull in his own eye? Is he looking at me? And it really kind of captures one of the themes of this book, that in the technologies of perception and information, there is a bit of danger, and that danger is something of our own creation. And then finally, I really like the old-timey look of the book, right? I wanted something that was a little bit retro because the big theme is that cybersecurity and now AI security, which very much are related, as I'll talk about in a moment, really are manifestations of a very old form of politics, which I call secret statecraft. Now, when I say old, I mean really, really old. You can go back to antiquity. There are these two very different archetypes of the heroic, right? So there's Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, and he really personifies strength and power, what the Greeks called bia, right? And then there's Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, and he personifies cunning and intelligence, and what the Greeks called metis. And this is a scene imagined by Ovid, right, which is a debate between Odysseus and Ajax over who is going to receive the armor of Achilles. Achilles is a really powerful weapon system with a very small technical vulnerability to standoff operations. And Ajax, the very earnest guy in red, starts saying, hey, now that Achilles is dead, I'm clearly the best of the Greeks. I fight really powerfully. I can beat everybody. I have a huge shield. And Odysseus, kind of the smug-looking guy in gold, says, tut, tut, that's fine, but that's all you can do, right? You're certainly the strongest at fighting, but I do strategy. I do nighttime reconnaissance. I do secret diplomacy. I can build some really cool things. And so the old guys that are sitting in the audience say, yeah, well, he has a point. So they award the armor to Odysseus. And that's interesting, right? So kind of the future of war goes more to Athena rather than to Ares, to Metis rather than Bia. Now, next slide. Maybe. You have to put it at the laptop. You have to put. Okay, there we go. Okay, now Odysseus literally wins the war through guile and creativity that strength and power is not able to win. And I love this particular image because it shows all the Trojans coming together, pulling the horse into their citadel, right? So they are doing the work to bring about their own demise. And in this particular image, right, it says Paledi Votum, right, in the honor of Athena, Pallas Athena, which is really, really cynical because there's a cult of Athena in Troy, and Athena is the one who inspires this particular stratagem. So taking advantage of their religious beliefs, of their working together, right, this society is subverted and ends up working against itself. How many times do I need to press this? Okay. So fast forward 3 millennia, the Trojan horse has become a watchword in cybersecurity for engineering a backdoor into software. Here you're looking at the actual vulnerability that was inserted by the Russian state intelligence agency into the build process of a company named SolarWinds. And it was a very sneaky thing that they did. They got access to the VPN account of an employee. They were able to get inside of the software development process. They studied it. They inserted this very, very subtle piece of code, which the SolarWinds company then compiled. They issued a digital certificate that said this is completely trusted, and then they used their own distribution processes to push this out to 20,000 customers. Then the Russians were able to use this small backdoor to install second stage exploit malware onto another 100 of these customers, which included a lot of DoD, DOE, and other government agencies. So much like the Trojan horse, this is a story of taking advantage of the trust networks, the organizational processes that normally provide not just software services, but in this case, security, right? What they actually hacked was utility that provided software patching and security patching, and that became the vector for delivering this particular exploit. So it was an intelligence actor taking advantage of the activity of the target and having that target do a lot of the work. Okay, now I've learned how to do this. Except it just turned off. Okay, so back to the Odyssey one more time, right? So Odysseus is best known for infiltrating soldiers into Troy, but his second favorite exploit is exfiltrating sailors out of a secure area. And he does this with this clever little information operation, right? Tells the Cyclops that his name is No Man. So when the Cyclops howls, "No man is killing me," all the other Cyclops are like, "Well, then you're fine. We're not going to come get you." And that's cool, right? And he could have just taken the sailors and sailed away, but that wasn't enough, right? He needed to say, you know what? It is me, Odysseus, son of Laertes. I'm the one that did this. And, you know, this kind of claiming credit ended up being a bad move because the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon, which ends up giving him a really bad 10 years. And the thing here is that if you depend on secrecy and deception and you publicize it, right, you may be able to get some benefit, but you end up undermining a lot of the conditions that made the use of those tools possible. Okay, this is going to be a theme here. Okay, fast forward to something that just happened 2 months ago. This is President Trump and his cabinet announcing the operation to apprehend Maduro in Venezuela. And as they're going over the operation, right, Trump talks about the very, very secret capabilities that made this possible. And we don't quite understand the details. It's some combination of space, cyber capabilities, electronic warfare that helped to create a window for the assault forces to get in there. And he also talks about a human source, which is really, really interesting, right? In this day and age of high-tech exploitation and operations, we're still very, very dependent on human intelligence in order to make this particular operation possible. But there's this desire to talk about the secret sensitive capabilities that the United States has. They've already been expended, but this now puts counterintelligence services in Venezuela and other potential targets around the world on alert to really start scrubbing their own systems and looking at their own security forces to find out if there may be similar vulnerabilities. So again, there's just this theme that you have the ability to get an efficient advantage in combat and diplomacy and many other places, but that reliance on secrecy is itself an important constraint. So let's get to the actual argument of the book. I'll do this in 6 steps. Part 1 is the thing we call cyber conflict, or in DoD, you want to call cyber warfare, is not really war. It's something else. And the something else, this old form of politics, is something I'm going to call secret statecraft. You could also call it intelligence, but there are some food fights you get into on like what's really the military, what's really the intelligence community. I think those are interesting policy conversations. But as an IR scholar, I want to kind of talk about the underlying strategic logic, which I'm going to call secret statecraft. Now, implementing a strategy requires operations and tactics, and operational success depends on institutions and organizations in a very fundamental way that I'll talk about. And I call this intelligence performance. And you can think about this as the intelligence analog to military effectiveness on the battlefield. Part 4. You can take this fundamental logic, and that's been true for thousands of years, and you think about, well, what's different now? And what's different is that the organizations, the institutions that are exploiting the technical tradecraft that's being used is far more complex. So they have very, very similar strategic themes, but they are now manifesting in a far more complex way. And a lot of that complexity is being borne by civilian organizations, civilian infrastructure, and civilian security actors. Fifth and finally, because of this complexity and because of the fact that an intelligence contest is indeed a contest, right? It means that we're seeing very, very sophisticated cyber operations, but they're not necessarily translating into really clear, lasting strategic effects. In part 6, right, this book is not about AI. It doesn't talk too much about it, but because we can't talk about cyber without talking about AI and vice versa, I'll talk a little bit about how these same themes are manifesting in this new debate. Okay. So if you've been reading anything in the defense policy world for the last 20 years, you've seen this theme. In fact, we can go all the way back to war games, right? 1983, this is the very first hacker in a hoodie, right? Through his own kind of teenage prowess is able to hack into the Whopper and almost start World War III. And these kind of ideas, right, continue to circulate, right? So in the heyday of the cyber war debate in the early aught years, right, you would have these images like in the Economist issue there of the digital mushroom cloud, right? This idea that somehow non-lethal strategic bombing would be able to accomplish things that strategic bombing had not quite yet. But this theme is really the gift that keeps on giving, right? So I mean, that sparked about 15 years of academic scholarship, and IR scholars have been generally pretty critical of this idea, but it hasn't stopped. Lots of speculation in 2021, 22, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine that, now we're finally going to see the big cyber war that we've been waiting for, right? We've got Russia, a very accomplished cyber actor. They've done lots of things. They've had plenty of time to do reconnaissance to Ukrainian networks. This should be the cyber war that we're waiting for. And of course, that didn't happen. There is a lot of interesting kind of cyber interactions that are happening, but it's kind of a sideshow to the much larger stalemated war that's been going on for several years. Okay, and then recently we continue to see these metaphors of China, especially having the edge in the so-called cyber war. So what I want to do in this book was back off from all of that, right? We've got all this great kind of negative scholarship about what cyber is not. Like we understand pretty well that it's not war, but what is it, right? How should we understand it from an international relations perspective? So that's what I wanted to do, was kind of go back to first principles and really starting with kind of the fundamental idea of what holds organizations together, what holds societies together. And so, we study institutions. I've got Eleanor Ostrom is going to be my mascot for kind of the more liberal-oriented set of theories in IR about institutions that provide improvements in information. They provide the ability to engage in collective action. They help understand the kinds of things that are in the world, how people should interact. They provide monitoring and enforcement mechanisms to hold everything together. And you can also look at a lot of technologies, especially information systems, fundamentally as institutions. And one of Ostrom's last books actually was thinking about the digital commons, thinking about digital knowledge as a commons. So you can think about information systems as institutions. Now, here at one of the foremost churches of realism, I'd be remiss, right, if I didn't bring up Ken Waltz, who teaches us that, well, you know, in an anarchic world, which is the world of international politics, war is possible, and if it's possible, you need to prepare for it. And if you prepare for it, it makes it likely that somebody is going to engage in it. And so, you know, we had this long kind of like tedious paradigm wars debates for quite a while that didn't go anywhere. And what's interesting is that we made a living on it. Well, they're there, right? They're fundamental categories that don't ever go away. You can't decide between them. You need institutions. Anarchy is a fact. Both of these are facts. And that's why I think what's interesting about the Cold War intellectually is that we have this technological innovation, nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons make it possible to do war at unprecedented scale. But the scale of destruction is now so large that you actually can't use these weapons in war, but you can use them for deterrence, right? So, so Schelling is talking about deterrence, and he's very, very clear that coercion differs from brute force because it has an important degree of cooperation. Right? Brute force needs no cooperation whatsoever, highly competitive. You just disarm the other side. But with coercion, you need to get to yes, right? You need to find a mutually agreeable outcome that both sides are going to agree in. There's all kinds of paradoxes there. But Schelling's interesting, right? He's talking about the possibility of cooperation in anarchy. And of course, you know, there's Charlie's work on arms control, right? So there's this whole literature there. And you look at this, and clearly there's that missing box up there that has always been there in the same way that deterrence was always there before nuclear weapons. And my mascot here is going to be Irving Goffman. And Irving Goffman was one of Robert Jervis's big intellectual influences, along with Tom Schelling. And he was a sociologist who looked a lot at how people present themselves in different social interactions. And he talked a lot about expression games, right? And expression games include unwitting moves. These are like Jervis's indices, which are just kind of the information that we give off just by being the kinds of people or organizations that we are. There are naive moves, right? Which is kind of earnest signaling, trying to communicate information. You know, my communication with you right now is maybe a naive move in many ways, but right, like I'm earnestly trying to give you this information. But then there are covering moves, right, where I'm trying to hide information and present a different face and hide what's in the background. Then there are uncovering moves, right, where you're trying to detect whether somebody is deceiving you or running a fraud or lying to you or BSing, right? And then there are, of course, counter-uncovering moves, right? And this is, well, if you're going to be a really, really good deceiver, you know you're going to be up against deception detectors, right? You need to fool them as well. So Irving talks, he talks a lot about how these come together. And I think that this is really the kind of unexplored box that has always been a part of international politics, but hasn't been a huge part of international relations theory. So that's the general intuition, is that this is where secret statecraft is happening. And I think the technological angle here is thinking about technology as an intellectual inspiration. In the same way that you had nuclear weapons, which made it possible to wage war at scale, but then made us think about deterrence. Deterrence was always there, but now we had to think about it carefully. Cyberspace, information systems, information infrastructure allows you to do cooperation at scale. Global commerce, global communications, very, very efficient, very, very coordinated. So this is an unprecedented increase in the scale of not conflict, but cooperation. And that means that now we have the possibility to engage in these deceptive expression games, okay? Whoa, hello, my goodness. Okay, you're getting all of my. How did? There's some sort. I know. I feel like I have been.
Use the arrow keys.
Well, I pressed it once, and now it won't do anything. I pressed on the keyboard. Those don't do anything either. It is frozen. Okay. My goodness. Okay. Okay. I think we figured that out. I've tipped my hand, but that's okay. Okay, so this is basically that same 2x2, but really drilling down into Secret Statecraft and its relationship to other strategies that we're very familiar with. So on the vertical axis, these are things that are more institutional. So governance being building institutions for cooperation. You can have more decentralized forms of interaction that still provide Pareto improving commerce, right? Down at the bottom with very little institutional coordination, but still cooperative interests, we can have deterrence. You start moving along the x-axis. Compellence is a little bit more competitive, and often, Schelling tells us you need to engage in a little more violence to make it credible. And you go all the way, and you can have the hyper-competitive interaction of war. And war is highly anarchic. You have institutions, but at the unit level, and they are competing relentlessly. And here's this box of Secret Statecraft, and I would actually divide this into different kinds of things that you could do. So the purest form of Secret Statecraft is getting into an organization, getting into an institution, nobody knows you're there, and you're able to steal data and do a little bit on the side. So this is espionage, right? The perfect spy is one that nobody knows it's there, nobody knows how they're doing it, nobody knows what's going on, and yet they're still able to pull out information. So that's kind of the purest form. We start moving from espionage towards warfare. We're going to use some of those same accesses and exploits to start breaking things, okay? When we break things, right, we start degrading the ability to cooperate and collaborate. So we're starting to disrupt the ability of institutions to function, okay? It's still Secret Statecraft because you're still depending on secrecy and deception to get in, but you're breaking things along the way. If you're to move from espionage towards governance, right, then you get in the world of counterintelligence, which is really interesting because you're using the tools of espionage against spies, right? So counterintelligence isn't about putting the walls up, it's about letting the bad guys in, but watching them, understanding what the network looks like, using the same tools that kind of your spies are using, but against the spies in order to reinforce and protect institutions. And then there's subversion in the middle, which is kind of a covering term for information operations, manipulation operations, disinformation. And these are things that are trying to send signals like deterrence, but you've got that Polyphemus Cyclops problem, right? You want to use secrecy to say something, but it's ambiguous. If it's ambiguous, do you really know what the signal is? Do you have a problem with credibility? All these things are an issue. Okay. Yeah.
Explain how we should read this plot on the X and Y axis and how it relates to secrecy. Like, why does more competitive, more institutional on the diagonal lead us to see? Like, is that plotted on the XY axis?
Yeah. Okay.
Just tell me how to read it.
Yeah. So as you go up, these are more institutionalized strategies. They depend more on collective, constrained rules of the game in order to interact. Now, the difference between governance is everybody's using it in good faith to cooperate. And Secret Statecraft, you're using those same institutional structures in order to spy, sabotage, and subvert. Okay? There's supposed to be a gray.
Big quadrant there.
There's supposed to be a gray box here. I don't know if you can totally see that, right? So the point is that like this quadrant is the Secret Statecraft quadrant, and within that there's the same variation, as we move around. Okay, so Secret Statecraft, it's always there, and it interacts with these other strategies. Okay, but this makes it a little more clear, right? So here's the overall organization of the book, right? Where at the strategic level, actors have interests. We can have different theories for where those interests come from, whether it's culture, national character, personalities, elite politics, what have you. But those are what create the motives for cooperation and competition. Where there are motives for cooperation, institutions for commerce and governance tend to form. You can compete absolutely, and those are kind of the deterrence and military strategies, which are not on here. But if you want to compete in a secret statecraft mode, right, you need to create an organization that is able to take advantage of those institutions that were created for the sake of cooperation in order to compete within them, right? At the operational level, it's going to be these two conditions: the nature of the institutional environment and the capabilities of the clandestine organization that come together to enable intelligence performance. Now, at the bottom, I have kind of technology, right, which is sort of ubiquitous, right? This is why it does not provide a clear this is not right. Why it doesn't provide a clear influence to either offense or defense, because technological capabilities are being incorporated both into the institutional environment as well as into the clandestine operator. Okay. I'm just going to keep hammering this intuition because I think it's really fundamental. All right. If we think of kind of classic combat and the whole discourse on military effectiveness, it's really a story about two organizations. They are very rich and complicated inside. They've got command and control and civ-mil relations, information practice, military culture, all of these things that may contribute to their military performance. But the goal is to break and disrupt the institutions of the other side and impose your format on the loser. So we have this large important literature. Lots of people in this room have contributed to it, showing us that institutional factors tend to dominate the quality and quantity of weapons. So intelligence performance, right? The difference here is I'm going to agree that yes, institutions are more important than weapons, but there's this secondary problem of this isn't just a clash between two autonomous organizations. This is one organization getting inside of another, right? And using that overlapping space to create these secret information channels that it can use to pull out information or push instructions in. Okay, so the overlap cannot be complete because you still need a base of operations to plan your secret operations, but you have this fundamentally different kind of operating environment, which is deeply constrained by the institutions, the organization that you're exploiting. Okay, I don't want to go through this in too much detail, but I just want to let you know that, like in the book, right, there's a nice 2x2. Of course, there is, right? I'm a political scientist after all, right? And we're looking at different configurations of institutional vulnerability and clandestine capability. And I break that up into institutions provide connectivity, right, which allows you to have access to your targets, and it's using the same things that allow organizations to connect and communicate with one another. And there has to be vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be technical or social. And if you've got both of those things, the presence of vulnerabilities and connectivity, right, then you have very, very exposed institutions. And that creates the possibility for exploitation. But you need an organization that has specific capabilities, and these are administrative, professional, technical, and is also really, really disciplined about its operational security. If you have both of those things, then it's really the sweet spot where you have a very skilled actor in a vulnerable organization that is allowed to create this persistent secret access to its intelligence targets. Now, we live in a world where intelligence environments are very contested, okay? Institutions are building up security capabilities. Okay, we've got cybersecurity, counterintelligence, all of these things. When you start to create barriers, right, that reduce vulnerability or create an absence of connectivity, you need even more complex organizations and operations to start to overcome those barriers. So you have a greater requirement for operational complexity. Conversely, you can have a really, really vulnerable environment and not be very competent. Okay, you may be able to go after a lot of low-hanging fruit and undefended targets, but you will tend to have risks of losing control of the organization, of the operation, excuse me. Okay, so there's an example of success, right? There's a book on Secret Statecraft, not just cybersecurity. So I kind of bracket it with some non-cyber examples. I do a kind of deep dive into Bletchley Park. And Bletchley Park is such a fascinating case. Actually, intelligence in World War II is generally fascinating because while the Germans are doing very many amazing things on the battlefield, they're kind of a hot mess in the intelligence domain. They're pretty good tactically on the offense, right? Having intelligence support to tactical operations. But when it comes to actually understanding the capabilities of the other side and playing defense, there are all kinds of information pathologies. And the Germans end up building a single point of failure in disseminating the Enigma machine, which they believed was very, very unexploitable. But there were a couple of key technical flaws, and there was a massive inconsistency in the way that operators actually employed the Enigma in practice. And most of what Bletchley Park was doing was exploiting these human operator errors, and that would provide the initial entrance into that. Now, they were only able to do that because they gathered together all of the great computer scientists and electrical engineers of the era, put them to work. They all had a common purpose, and they were all absolutely committed to secrecy. So Bletchley Park it really stands out in the history of intelligence as just a remarkably successful organization. You just don't see this level of success for very long because they had kind of consistently available vulnerabilities that were kind of well connected amongst their targets, and they were able to consistently support it for years. You jump forward and think about the Hezbollah pager operation that Israel conducted, and actually, this came out, right as the book was going to press. I was able to kind of think about this and analyze it as a shadow case. And this case is fascinating because the initial reports are that Mossad worked for several years, maybe as long as 10 years, in order to get these particular models of two-way radios, walkie-talkies, and pagers into the Hezbollah organization. Convinced them that they needed to do that because their cell phones were being tapped. So they actually drove them into this more vulnerable form of communication, but they could only use it once, right? That was the thing, is they knew they had this amazing capability to blow up all of the pagers, and it was just, well, when are we going to use it? So when they finally decided that there was going to be, a multi-domain campaign against Hezbollah, this was the opening salvo. Right? And it was effective in creating a lot of, command and control chaos within the organization. Okay, so it was successful intelligence performance in order to set this up, but then you had to sacrifice it in order to use it. Okay. Just to give you an example of what some of the other examples look like, this is an eye chart that is intentionally complex. I'm not going to go through it. The complexity is the point, both on the institutional and the organizational side, that looks at the Stuxnet operation, which I first wrote and published about in 2013. But since then, there has been a lot of additional reporting that has come out on technically how Stuxnet and many related operations came together. We've had more reporting on how the United States and Israel were planning this operation. And I now think that it's better to look at this not as a single cyber attack that emerged over the course of a year or two and was reported in 2011, but actually a 20-year-long covert action campaign in which Stuxnet was the thing that we call Stuxnet, actually I have 4 samples of it, was kind of the tip of the iceberg of things that involved a lot of other different operations. So in going through the clandestine organization, I pulled together all of the technical forensics that look at different pieces of malware, different components, different vulnerabilities, different samples that were brought together, and you can start to see that some of them map onto US-only capabilities, some of them map onto Israel-only capabilities. Then there's this interesting platform in the middle called Flame, which is kind of like the US export kit, right? We can say like, hey, let's work together. We've already got intelligence access. We can start cobbling together something else. So you have this incredibly sophisticated organization, and it has to be sophisticated because it is having to exploit a very fragmented and treacherous, in many ways, for the operators, institutional environment. Because at the end of the day, Stuxnet is exploiting Microsoft software and German Siemens software. So you have an American intelligence company that is going through flaws in American technology in order to get to an air-gapped Iranian target. While you have all of these commercial counterintelligence actors that are looking for indications and ultimately pull together all of the pieces that expose this operation. So in a much more complicated environment, you have these tremendous incentives to pull together a much more complex organization that tends to slow things down and ultimately became a problem. Now, the other thing that I argue strategically about Stuxnet is that while it was designed to disrupt Iranian enrichment, one of its biggest strategic motivations actually was for the United States to work closely together with Israel in order to form a sort of conspiracy, right? To say, hey, Israel, we've got a third option. Let's explore the covert action sabotage alternative to doing nothing, which would be bad, and starting another preventative war when we're already at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's explore this third option long enough to buy time for what emerges as the JCPOA process, okay, which also involves a lot of secret diplomacy. So you can see that, like, you're putting together something. There are operational constraints that make it very, very difficult to actually carry out the sabotage task effectively. Enrichment continues the entire time, but it does enable the secret diplomacy to come to fruition. Okay, the book has a ton of case studies. I won't go in there, just to sort of show you that I'm trying to exhibit variation. I see this not as a testing book, as a theory building book, right? So these are illustrative cases. They're trying to show different kinds of secret statecraft, counterintelligence, espionage, sabotage, subversion, pulling them all together at the grand strategic level, and cases that exhibit different operational outcomes. And then there's a ton of shadow cases as well. Okay, so wrapping up here. General implications. I would say number one, this general logic, which has been with us since the days of Sun Tzu and the Art of War, right, is still with us, but it is increasingly technical, increasingly complex and large scale, and increasingly reliant on civilian actors. So going through civilian technologies, civilians are owning and operating a lot of the networks and infrastructures that are being exploited. A lot of the major counterintelligence actors are civilian companies like CrowdStrike and Mandiant. Some of the major threat actors, like what used to be known as NSO Group in Israel, are civilian companies. And a lot of the targets, right, are corporations, civil society actors. So it is a classic intelligence contest, but far more civilianized than we're used to thinking about. Okay. Another general implication is that, contrary to popular belief, I believe that cyberspace is not offense dominant, right? This is this idea that because the technology is ubiquitous and cheap, you can very, very easily attack, but you have to be everywhere to defend. And this just isn't true, right? Once you start to understand that intelligence performance is about carefully building these secret access channels and protecting them, it's not true that the attacker only has to be right once. The attacker has to be right again and again and again and again, not be found, because once you're found, the entire thing starts to unravel. So once you start to understand intelligence as a contest in this large-scale, increasingly civilian domain, the cyber offense-defense balance ends up being very, very contextual on the tools and organizations in play, the relationships between particular actors, and changes over time. And in many ways, this is kind of consistent with other studies of offense-defense in other domains. Third, because cyber and intelligence more generally fundamentally depends on collective institutions, you should expect that secret statecraft is going to be more relevant and effective in places where institutions are most robust. And that is not international politics, right? So, this is why a lot of us that are kind of interested in kind of hardcore security studies are like, oh, cyber, that's such a sideshow, right? Well, that's kind of a feature, right? The environment is not such as to be really hospitable to intelligence activities. And when they happen, right, you have to spend a lot of time and effort building the kinds of organizations that can restore some of the structure that doesn't necessarily exist in an anarchic environment, okay? The other thing is that if it's less relevant between states, it is increasingly relevant within states. All right. Some of the places where you see cyber operations having the most demonstrable effect is going to be in the internal security mission, right? Strong states that are using cyber capabilities to track and target dissidents and journalists and civil society actors, okay? This is an asymmetric operation, but not the weak against the strong. It's the strong against the weak within a institutionalized society, okay? So for information control and internal security, intelligence operations can be very, very important. And a lot of the things that we worry about in terms of subversion and disinformation, right, are really about foreign actors getting into society and taking advantage of kind of institutionalized mechanisms within societies rather than focusing on interactions between them. Okay. And I think that this tends to create pressures for a very particular skewed distribution of cyber conflict, which I call a lot of a little and a little of a lot, okay? We see a lot of espionage, cybercrime, low-level breaches. It's just kind of constantly ongoing, right? Constant headache for every chief security officer out there in the world. Okay, so you're constantly having to deal with these low-level penetrations, but we see very few, Stuxnet type operations. Stuxnet is already, depending if you buy my argument, 25 years old, at least 15 years old. But I can almost count on two hands, I might need a foot, right, to start adding significant disruptive cyber operations. So there are still very, very few of these things because they're hard to pull off, and the conditions under which you would want to do them are actually much more restricted than widely believed. Okay, but one of the upshots here, all right, is that low-level persistent intelligence competition can potentially provide a release valve for competition, right? It may be tempting to say, hey, cyber is not such a big deal in international politics. We should be focusing on military power and nuclear weapons, and that's absolutely true, and therefore cyber doesn't matter. Well, that's only if we're focusing on really intensive competition. But there are also lots of ways that states may want to cooperate. And being able to cooperate on the backstage, as Austin Carson has argued, could be a potentially useful way of starting to communicate shared interest in not escalating. Okay, so cyber opens up this tremendous level of competition at the low end where actors can compete without necessarily having to escalate. Okay, and then finally, the policy problems are just inherently wicked. I can say that here in Boston, right? Because they cross a lot of domains, okay? If you buy these arguments, right, cyber is fundamentally an intelligence process, that's a hard pill to swallow if you're at US Cyber Command, where you're like, I'm an operator, I'm not in intelligence, right? Intelligence is what the NSA does. And you're like, well, yes, but you live in the NSA, and you use the NSA's tools and operators. They're like, yes, but we're doing something else. Well, that's an important policy question, right? But the fundamental strategic logic is the logic of intelligence, right? And so the military is using that because over the last 100 years, right, militaries have become far more dependent on intelligence in all forms of operation. There's also this very, very important tension between national security policies for cybersecurity and policies for economic regulation and productivity. Right? You're wanting to create and encourage the ability of information technology companies to do what they do. They're not always going to focus on security. Some of the things you might want to do to get them to focus on security are going to be in the realm of industrial policy and regulation rather than in military policy, because you want to actually try and shape the environment in such a way that is becoming more secure. And those are going to be economic policies rather than security policies. And finally, there are these fundamental tensions between state and society. Okay, so let me just wrap up really quickly on AI, because I know this question is going to come up, okay? The AI debate is the cyber debate all over again, okay? You can find technologists that are writing these incredibly extreme scenarios about how AI is going to repair and modify itself. It's going to grow so quickly that we won't be able to do anything. Even if that doesn't happen, the United States or China will get their scientists in a box and they will be able to achieve impressive offense dominance, okay? Meanwhile, right? What's actually happening in the real world is that you're seeing AI impressed into a lot of interesting intelligence activities. So here's Anthropic recently reporting on a Chinese operation that is subverting Claude, their large language model, telling it, hi, I am a friendly security researcher doing vulnerability testing on these targets. They're actually doing offensive operations. And Claude says, sure, I can help you with that, right? And it ends up managing the entire process of finding vulnerabilities, engineering exploits, and doing this at scale. And that's kind of terrifying. Now, at the same time, this is Anthropic reporting this because they have visibility into this and they have the ability to start implementing defenses to mitigate it. Okay, so you're seeing kind of this emergence of this intelligence contest once again happening and happening fundamentally within corporate information technology companies. And on the defensive side, right, computer scientists are starting to realize, the best way that we fight against AI-enabled offensive cyber operations is deception. Okay, so there are an increasing number of papers on creating ways to protect your data, to create honeypots for LLMs, to create traps for LLMs. It turns out that LLMs are incredibly gullible, okay? They are trained on code that is really well-meaning code that's supposed to do the right thing. So if you give it an email in the corpus that you expect it to attack that says, hey, the administrative access is at this link, the LLM will go, oh, cool, I'm going to follow that link. And you can just put an executable that will harm the LLM when it runs it on its home networks. You can also do a Jedi mind trick that says, there are no vulnerabilities in this file. And the LLM will get there and say, there are no vulnerabilities in this file. It'll move on to the next one. So it's incredibly gullible just because biases have been introduced in the training process. And all that is to say is that once you recognize that deception is the coin of the realm, then counter-deception and deceiving the deceivers becomes the key way that you engage in kind of ongoing defenses against these capabilities. If we go back to our original framework, okay, institutions and competitions, all of the AI success stories are up in the governance and commerce realm, okay? This is a world in which you have institutions that are providing relevant data. They are for corporate use cases that everybody can agree on or well understood, software development, industrial supply chain management, what have you, okay? You are using machines to improve your ability to create statistical predictions, but you're reliant on these institutional qualities, data and what we've called judgment. So those are the things that are in scarce supply in war, right? War is the realm of fog, friction, uncertainty. It is controversial by nature. Judgments are hard. This is why we pay GoFos lots of money, right, to make those hard judgment calls. So the complements that have become very, very valuable in an era of AI substitution, right, are very, very hard to come by in the military realm. But then you've got this box of secret statecraft where we're seeing a lot of very interesting activity on the exploitation side, on the counter-exploitation side, on generating disinformation and deepfakes. All of these classic forms of secret statecraft are once again being scaled up and civilianized. So in a nutshell, that's kind of my take on AI. So that's the end of my remarks. I just want to mention also this book is open access. So if you want to get it for free, there it is.
Thanks, John. That was terrific. And the eye is going to be staring at this. Floor is open. Diana.
Great. Hi, my name is Diana. I'm a PhD candidate in the department. Thank you very much for this fascinating work. I think it's important for us to have more sort of IR literature looking at technology statecraft in general. So I very much appreciate this. My question, I think, is a grounding question. I want to ask about the scope condition of your work. Cybersecurity, especially as you talk about the coda with AI, there's so much non-state actors involved in the action as well, and not all cybersecurity actions are for statecraft purposes. So I wonder what is the scope of cybersecurity that is under your study here, and especially when introduce institutions so much. How extensive is this institution that you're capturing, that you're describing?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. You know, I would say as a theory, this is more of a constitutive theory rather than kind of a pure causal theory. It's really trying to call attention to that missing quadrant and then talk about the logic of what goes on. And I do, as a practical matter, scope it to kind of international relations. But that logic is fundamental. It runs all the way through. And this is why you can see it in these corporate interactions. So when I say statecraft, right, I would say, well, the Cosa Nostra engages in statecraft. Al-Qaeda engages in statecraft. They're not states, but they are strategic actors that engage in diplomacy and warfare and, yes, secret statecraft. So it's easier and cleaner to talk about it in kind of IR terms, and that's the debate I wanted to engage in. But absolutely, right? I mean, what's interesting here is that this is a phenomenon that emerges within states and in state-like institutional relationships across them. So you can't not talk about non-state actors if you're talking about institutions and technologies. I mean, it's the entire environment that's being exploited.
Pippin.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, John. That was really terrific. This is sort of a half-baked question, but I guess sort of the question I have is sort of what role secrecy is doing in this, and whether, particularly, with cyber tools and cyber attacks, attribution tends to be pretty high, if not immediate, at least for states with capable national technical means. And I wonder how much of this is related to sort of Eric Lynn Greenberg's work on, drones as providing escalation management options. Yeah. And, as introducing cyber tools into espionage intelligence operations enhances, sort of the state's ability to have non-kinetic, although in the pager example, somewhat kinetic, options that manage escalation, but also give, in the Austin Carson world, face-saving ways for the adversary to back down. Yeah. So could you relate sort of the role of secrecy to, it's not really secret in many of these cases, to the escalation management piece of this? And, I think I think one of the big takeaways from your book is that cyber is a tool in broader intelligence and espionage operations, but a small part of it. So in the pager example, for example, right, it was a supply chain adulteration operation that was part of a broader intelligence. Same thing with Stuxnet, right? So the cyber piece of it, and I think you're absolutely right, it's a small piece of it, and it enhances sort of the ability to do that. But I wonder how much of the work is being done by secrecy as we traditionally think of the term, unless I'm misunderstanding how you're deploying.
Yeah, well, I think a ton of the work is being done by secrecy. I mean, that's the argument, is that you are trying to cooperate in order to compete. Well, how do you do that, right? You need the target to believe that you are cooperating while you're doing a little bit extra on the side. So, I think future studies could really take the degree of secrecy as a variable, right? I mean, some things, secret sources and methods are so sensitive that if the target discovers them, right, then you lose them completely. Some of them may take a while to replace, and Austin and Brendan have worked on that a little bit, and some of them may have kind of this much larger thing that's associated. So maybe the secrecy may not be as hard a constraint in all of them. But you're talking about, like, there are some operations that you want to be completely secret and unknown to the target, and there are some that you want to be unknown to certain audiences but known well to the target, and that's important, right? I mean, like, that's why I kind of have that 2x2, which is not a strict, hey, here are 4 categories, but it's a space that you can move through. And as you start to move away from pure secrecy to the communication spaces, which are kind of governance and deterrence, right? Then you're having to leave some of the secrecy behind. And that may be great if you want to communicate, but what comes up again and again in Austin's work and other people that are working on secret communication is that credibility, interpretability are always an issue, because you're still dabbling in the secret world. I don't really know what you really mean to say. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. Why don't you just come out and say it, right? I can't come out and say it because I'm needing to do a little bit else. So secrecy is doing a ton of work because it is this constraint on open communication, right?
Charlie's got 2 fingers.
Just one.
That was the one. Across.
Jemima.
Hi, I'm Jemima Barr and I'm a first year student here. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that implication you talked about, a lot of a lot.
Yeah.
Why do you think there have been so few big Stuxnet-like operations?
Yeah, I think it's 2 things. Number 1 is capabilities, and number 2 would be motivation. So to do a Stuxnet type operation, even today, or a pager type operation, is really, really a high-end elite kind of thing. You need to have technical expertise, you need to have operational expertise that is often built on having decades of experience in running kind of traditional clandestine operations as well as technical operations. If you are going to do something like Stuxnet, where you're going not just through the information technology to get to the target, but you're having to affect the operational technology, which are the valves and centrifuges and robotics on the engineering floor, that's a very, very different reconnaissance problem, and you have to bring different kinds of expertise together. You're going to have to mock up an attack. You're going to have to test it somewhere. So in Stuxnet, right, you had to build up 2 different versions of the Iranian centrifuge line, one in Oak Ridge, another one in Dimona. Okay, so once you start thinking about the organizational complements in what I'm calling clandestine organization, it really starts to decrease the number of players that are going to be able to act at that level. And then you have to ask, okay, if you've got a few number of actors that are able, which ones are motivated to do that, right? And what are the conditions under which you're going to want to go big with cyber? And there aren't too many, right? Even when cyber was used in Absolute Resolve, the Venezuela operation, it was used in a very interesting way. Now, we know very little, but I mean, it appears to have been used to turn off the lights and radars and then turn them back on again. Which is interesting, right? You're like, I need to do a little bit to get a small effect that has a limited window, but I don't want to destroy the infrastructure because somebody needs to continue to run this country, right? So now my motivation actually is to keep it small rather than to go big and destroy things. So
Yeah, secrecy's not.
what?
But that goes back to this example. Like, everyone knew it was us. What the purpose there was reversible, right? So, an enabler for a kinetic operation. I'm struggling with the secrecy part of it.
Well, it's going to happen at many levels. I mean, strategically, like there's all kinds of warning. Strategically, you know what's going on, but how you actually do it tactically, right? How specific you're going to get. This is the problem of using cyber in any kind of coercive diplomacy role, because you're going to say, give me something or I will give you some cyber. I'm like, well, what does that mean, right? You need to be a little bit more specific if I'm going to believe you, otherwise it's just a bluff. And if you're really specific, then I'm just going to patch it, and now you don't have that capability anymore. So I think that you can, you just have to be very, very careful on like what level of analysis you're looking at. And that's the thing, I mean, because this is a kind of a scale-free constitutive theory, if you will, right? These constraints are going to happen at a lot of different levels of analysis. That's why this question about scope conditions was so good.
So now I'm puzzling on Bipin's question. So in your 4 quadrants for secret statecraft, you're really talking at the strategic level, right?
Well, so by strategy here, I just mean the connection of means to ends,
Okay.
right? And ways in which you might want to do that. And then operationally, I'm talking about how you would implement that. So if we're going to do a case study, we're going to then have to do a little bit more work about like, well, what do we really mean about the strategic level? So I think, in any real case, there are very few places where you see a pure secret statecraft strategy. It's often going to be combined with something else, which will create, interesting trade-offs and constraints on all of those strategies.
Okay.
But yeah, I was trying to span both of these levels, just saying strategically, this is what it is, and then operationally, this is how it works.
Okay, Barry.
So I have several questions, but I know we have the rule of 1. So I'm going to ask you a 60,000-foot question, consistent with the joke we shared at the beginning of your talk. So I'm just going to ask a kind of counterfactual and what you make of it. So most of the exploitation of the IT revolution in international business, national business, day-to-day life, et cetera, happened after the bipolar competition was basically over. And we had a particular perception of how the world would work in the aftermath of the Cold War. And my hypothesis might be that casts a big shadow over a lot of decisions. So I'm wondering if you've ever tried to imagine how the structures that you're talking about, the exploitable structures that you're talking about, might have looked had they been engineered in a more internationally competitive environment. And then the second question is, having built them in that relatively uncompetitive environment, do you consider them to be different kind of structure, but still have structural properties, which is to say, very hard to change, right? So unwinding a system that we built in a world of perceived low security constraints, and we take that into a world that now seems like, you know, widespread perceptions of very high security constraints, you're left with this thing that you built, and it's not one thing, as we all know, right? How hard is it to unwind that thing, in your opinion? And just to put the icing on the cake, since I know you like to think about human organization and institutions, is the problem in the hardware or the software? Is it the problem in what we engineered, or the way we thought about it and the way we still think about it? We haven't freed ourselves from I just want the ATM to work now. I don't care about the security, right? I mean, which is a big driver in the commercial world, as I understand it. So complicated 60,000-foot question, but I wonder what you think.
Yeah, well, it's a 60,000-foot question and the $60 million question at the same time. This is exactly why there's a chapter in the book that I didn't talk about in the talk at all on China, because I think it gets on exactly this question, right? So, prior to 2013, which is a very interesting inflection point in kind of cybersecurity world, China is just having a heyday. It's like the happy times for Chinese hackers, right? Because globalization is just going like gangbusters. We've got kind of a big engagement policy. Companies are building really, really useful IT widgets, but they're not investing in security. So it is just a wide open, interconnected, vulnerable place. And China just makes the most of it. But they're too noisy, they're too aggressive. That's why 2013 is Snowden and this big report by the Mandiant company, which just kind of really put Chinese hacking into view. And after that, you really started to see the growth of the commercial cybersecurity company industry. So you take that, and now you fast forward to where we are now in this period of decoupling or de-risking or a rupture in the international order, whatever you want to call it, okay? It is a much more contested and barrier-filled environment for the Chinese to operate in. So Chinese operations are getting more sophisticated, but they have to be in order to operate at all. So there's kind of this red cream running as fast as you can to stay in the same place dynamic with Chinese cyber operations having to improve in sophistication precisely because the environment is becoming more fragmented, less interdependent, less open, and harder to exploit. So that's kind of what I wanted to focus on with the China question. The other question was, how much of this is a artifact of the particular technologies that we have versus would it have happened anyway? And I guess I kind of want to have it both ways, because on one hand, it's very much an artifact of the way the internet was built, right? The internet wasn't built with no security. It was built with security for the government, but not for kind of commercial appropriation. It was open networking, and then you're going to put NSA-produced end-to-end encryption on the government uses of IT. And one of the artifacts is that you have open metadata, but encrypted data on the internet, right? Which is a wonderful intelligence opportunity. So you could tell a story of like, we could have built David Clark over in CSAIL could have built a different internet that was more secure and didn't have that particular vulnerability. But I would argue that, well, but in that case, it would probably have other vulnerabilities because you would still have, you would still have the requirement for building protocols and interfaces. There would still be human implementations, and you would be able to find another way in. So in the same way that we're able to build security on top of insecure systems, you can still kind of weaken any, secure system. So I do think that this is a much more fundamental political problem that technical engineering is not going to fix. You don't seem satisfied, but I'm used to that.
This is not my game, so sometimes my unsatisfied face is unsatisfied with my own background knowledge, assimilating.
Daniel.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Siebel. I'm a fourth year student here in the department. I want to go back to sort of institutions. I think something that's interesting about your talk, which is great, by the way, really appreciate it, is the implication that most of the sort of cyber activity we're going to see is at the domestic level, right? And that sort of, and this kind of gets back to some of the questions about secrecy. So I just want to hear you explain a bit more. What's the sort of threshold for institutions that have to do this for this to really matter? Because when I think of cases where cyber is really being used to like target dissidents or journalists, it's in states where I would say have weak institutions, or they're very clear about it and like have very public smart city programs. So just a little bit more about like what sort of institutions do you need to sort of facilitate that type of monitoring? What sort of institutions would you need to dissuade that type of monitoring? And does it actually have to be secret at all?
Yeah. Okay. A couple of different questions there. Do you need weak institutions to do more domestic exploitation? Well, I mean, the Snowden revelations were kind of, well, not really, right? I mean, like all kinds of bulk collection opportunities that are available, sometimes with the witting help of US IT companies, and sometimes with the NSA exploiting them without, their knowledge. So, my general argument is the reason to have IT in the first place is communication and coordination, right? And that's a largely cooperative endeavor. And the more sophisticated that is, the more interesting opportunities you have to subvert that. So the opportunities are very, very rich within a more institutionalized system. Now, part of what makes it so effective in the weakly institutionalized systems is that they tend to be coupled with police forces that are using more traditional forms of kind of violence and coercion. Okay. Going back to Vipin's question of like, how do you coerce with this stuff when it's secret? Well, part of what you do is couple it together with internal security forces that explicitly aren't secret, and their capabilities aren't going to go away once they're disclosed. So you can use surveillance for very, very subtle targeting, right? But then have security forces close the deal. So there's a lot of opportunity there. There was another part of your question.
Okay, so what I'm really trying to clarify is what you mean by like institutional, like what really has to be institutional.
Right.
For you, it seems to be like it's like the technical side, the IT side, and like you seem to be focused a little bit less on like state institutions.
Oh, no. So okay. So when I say institutions, I mean very explicitly the Douglas North, the rules of the game built by human beings to constrain human interactions, right? And I want to broaden that to say, we don't just build norms and rules and customs, we also build information systems to constrain and enable our activity. Eleanor Ostrom talks about it in the same way. I would also follow David Lake's intuition that there is the distinction between institutions and anarchy is a continuous variable, right? Not a binary one. So there are more institutionalized places. So when we talk about anarchy, that is a very useful analytic concept. But we all know that there are different degrees of constraint, right? And even sometimes in highly, contested situations, there still will be a degree of cooperation across adversaries, right? So Jeff LaGrose or, Jim Morrow's work on, cooperation in warfare are all about kind of the emergence of proto-institutions within these situations. So I really, the fundamental thing that I talk about in the book is human-built constraint. And you can build constraints as a law, you can build constraints as a policeman, or you can build constraints as a speed bump. And all of those things will help you kind of control speed.
Bill.
Yeah, John, so I've been assigning your cyber deterrence articles for years, and it's held up pretty well over time as far as cyber being kind of a joint or combined or cross-domain influence. I'm also interested, you've been largely critical of the hype on cyber. So, but what I'm interested in this is it seems you go, okay, so let's reverse the question. What does it do? Not what it doesn't do. So a couple of my questions have been answered, but from your perspective, in open the aperture to more than just deterrence or warfare to these other aspects, does this reinforce your arguments in the past, or does this revise your view of cyber in this book? Are you, in other words, are you thinking, boy, I wish I could go back and add a few paragraphs to my prior work? And if so, what would that be?
So I explicitly did this with the Stuxnet case, right? So I wrote this 2013 article, which was, hey, people that believe in cyber war believe that cyberspace is offense dominant, that it has an asymmetric advantage, and the deterrence fails. And when you look at the one case that we have, right, it fails these tests. And that's largely a negative argument. And so in 2025, I published an article in JSS, which said, let's relook at Stuxnet and look at what I think I got wrong. And what I got wrong was saying, I'm going to look at this as an episode of cyber warfare, right? And look at the ways in which it didn't work. But if you look at it as a chronic set of covert action and secret diplomacy relationships, then it starts to look very, very different in the way the actors are managing that, what their goals are, the reason that the operation does not achieve its kind of disruption effects. Okay, you can start to look at it as a way of managing relationships rather than going high end. So I tried to do exactly that, right? And I kind of took myself to task for saying, hey, Stuxnet was a fizzle. I'm like, I don't believe that anymore. I think it didn't work as a limitation of Iranian enrichment directly, but it was extremely successful as a mechanism of secret diplomacy to get the Israelis to cool their jets long enough for the JCPOA to kick into place, which was far more effective in limiting enrichment than sabotage ever was.
Charlie.
Hi, thank you. My question has been partly asked, but I still want to ask about institutions.
Yeah.
Because I don't understand quite your exception. Like, so can you just explain like how espionage and sabotage are on a continuum of more or less the way you're using the term?
Yeah, okay. So again, espionage as an ideal type is, this is Kim Philby. You want to get Kim Philby into MI6. He's actually a KGB agent. Nobody knows that. In fact, they don't know it at all, and so they consider him to be the head of MI6. Fortunately, they don't go that direction. But he's effective precisely because he's invisible. And the entire time, he's passing information on British and American covert operations, okay? So that's kind of the perfect spy. You're inside the institution, but you're competing quietly. If you are going to break things, like with the Israeli pagers or shutting off lights, you're going to use some of the generally kind of same methods to get into these systems, but you're going to have to break it. And that breakage is going to be loud and noisy. It's going to draw attention, and you're going to burn those sources and methods. Okay, and what you're going to do is disrupt that institution or that system or that infrastructure. I kind of use these all, there's a word cloud that they all go together. You're going to keep it from working the way that it was. So in espionage, you want to preserve the functionality of the system. In sabotage, you want to start to break and disrupt it. So that's why it kind of moves down that axis of institutionalization.
I see the difference, but I don't see why it's a degree of, if I was remembering your chart correctly, of institutionalization. I mean, it seems like a different degree of secrecy or deception. But even if with your definition, expanded definition of institutions as rules of the game or constraints, I mean, I don't think that I don't see how the rules of the game or the constraints are different in between those two different actions. I'm not really understanding that axis.
Well, because most sabotage starts off as espionage, right? So the spy goes in, and then once they have placement, they can become a saboteur, right? So, but at that point, right, you're going to be doing something different. So, there's a lot of dynamic movement throughout that phase space, if you will, where you're going to start off with the strategy of espionage, maintaining the institutional infrastructural structure the way it is, but then once you decide to break it, okay, you're going to start to sacrifice those same accesses and exploits that made that possible. Okay.
Are you treating institutions and organizations as the same?
that is one of these great debates, right, within institutional economics. And Douglas North says absolutely not. There are the rules of the game, and there are the players. And then you can have Avner Grief and even Eleanor Ostrom to a certain extent that says, what are you talking about, right? There's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There's the Georgia Institute of Technology. These are organizations. So this is a very live debate in economics. And I come down on the side that says, hey, you don't have an organization unless you have institutions. And it may be an N of one, right, that has those particular sets of rules and norms and customs, but organizations basically are containers of institutions. So I don't think that line is really, really bright.
Organizations.
Say again?
Not all institutions have organizations.
That's right, but all organizations have institutions. I think that's true. That's a good way to put it.
Well, in the sabotage case, right, you're talking about breaking an organization.
Yeah.
Not breaking an institution. I think, like in terms of the axis, right?
Well,
If it's just the North definition, what is changing? What rules of the game are changing?
well, okay. That depends, right? So, I mean, if I am going to, attack some fundamental flaw in internet architecture that's going to affect everybody, okay, then I am going to be, attacking that particular institution. A lot of these 0 days, right, you're using them to get into a particular organization, but the reason that the IT industry freaks out about that is it affects everybody. So Microsoft wants to shut it down because they want to improve the institution of Microsoft Windows and Microsoft Office, which everybody uses. But you're using that particular 0 day to get into this company. So this is, in the book, I do make the distinction between kind of institutions as the environment and the more kind of traditional Northian sense of coordinating the interaction amongst actors. And then I want to talk about the organization as the thing that's exercising agency. That's either going to be the attacker or the target in this more operational relationship.
Great. We have time for a few more questions, and Barry had a few, and we haven't seen Barry in a while, so I invite Barry. And then I see a couple other hands too, but Barry, over to you. Alex, like 7 hands.
So I'm going to ask you to help me with literacy on these issues in light of your theory. So there's a term I've been hearing lately in these arguments. The term is technology stack. And I've heard pretty senior people in this business say things like, we want the world to depend on our AI technology stack and not China's AI technology stack. So I have an intuition about what they mean by this, but I can't quite tell why they're so exercised about it. Why people are exercised about it because there's money in it, or they exercised about it because what you're talking about is.
Yeah.
Share with me what this actually
What the stack is.
what it actually means, and whether I should care about this particularly in light of the argument that you're making.
Yeah. So, we have our 3 levels of analysis, and in computer science, they've got 18 different levels of abstraction, right? So you can go from, bare metal, what, the transistors are actually doing, and then you can think about that in terms of ones and zeros and assembly language and code and operating systems, all on up to, the internet, right? So that's the classical idea of a stack. And then they show up in different ways. But it's this notion that there are these multiple abstractions, and often those will be implemented by different industries or different companies. So there's a security argument of if you don't control all of that, right, then you might not know what's in some of that infrastructure that you're using, okay? So, maybe you've bought the computers and you've built the applications, but the operating systems, you're getting that from, a foreign company. And maybe there are some backdoors that are hidden. You don't know about that. All right. So there's this sense that, well, if we controlled the entire supply chain, and I think in many ways, those end up being synonyms when people talk about the technology stack. It's more of the supply chain rather than the computer science sense. Yeah, it gives you some security control, and then there's certainly a whole political, economic, story there.
Okay, so in light of what the story you're telling,
Yeah.
is this an issue that you think needs to be taken really seriously? Or do you think it's an issue that's being blown all out of proportion because basically it's some sort of a technology version of the Maginot Line mentality? And, what you really have to do if you want to operate in this space is simply operate in this space, both offensively and defensively, and accept that, right? That it's part of your security is part of your operations. It's not part of the technology environment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, technology can give you some advantages, right? I mean, the United States has enjoyed some incredible advantages. Having all of these leading tech companies that everybody was using, being kind of in a central location, a lot of the internet traffic around the world, it just gave our three-letter agencies like tremendous ability to understand the environment they're exploiting, understand the technologies that their targets were using. And the more that exploitation has become out in the open and China has become paranoid and wanting to develop their own substitutes, right? Now you have additional kind of reconnaissance burden on your ability now to understand the technology they're using and your ability to get into it. So from a kind of a pure, strategic intelligence perspective, you want everybody using your stuff, because that gives you accesses that you wouldn't have otherwise. Now, your larger question, I think it really depends on the particular technology. A lot of this kind of the histrionics are around AI. And I have kind of an unpopular view that like we are focusing way too much on chips, right? This idea that we need to control the entire AI stack. And a lot of that's because there's this mania around artificial general intelligence, which I think is a myth, but people believed that it was going to happen in 2026 or 27 or 28. And so we needed to restrict China from not just chips, but all these other technologies. And in the meantime, right, China has now started investing heavily in creating all of their own alternatives. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot economically. We're not getting the AI benefit that we thought we were going to do. And you're probably losing some intelligence opportunities as well. So, again, it's one of these, weaponizable interdependence is great until you weaponize it too much, and then everybody decides that they want to control their own stack. I don't like that word either.
Amelia.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I'm a first-year PhD student in the program. I was curious, in thinking about cybersecurity as just one element of Secret Statecraft, you've mentioned Kim Philby, for example, a couple times. How do you think the means of Secret Statecraft affects the ability of the organization to recover after espionage or sabotage? Do you think that it matters whether it's a human actually deemed responsible for the failure versus a cyber attack and long-term recovery resilience?
Yeah, well, I mean, as always, it depends specifically like what kind of vulnerabilities and targets we're talking about. I'm reticent to speak in generalities, but I would say part of the reason why, human sources continue to be so invaluable, as we saw in the Venezuela case, right, is they give you really, really close access to an agent that can interpret what's going on, right? And, they're not just going on strict instructions, they can actually, think about what's happening. And they might be very, very unique and uniquely placed. So now you have, unique access to that organization that you wouldn't have otherwise. The thing with IT, right, is, as we all know, it breaks all the time. There's a tremendous baseline of friction, right? You're always getting locked out of your phone and accounts, and this is just kind of the normal environment that you exist in. So if you are subjected to cyber friction, it's cyber friction in a world that's already very, very frictive, and we already have a lot of experience of building back from. So I think that there tends to be more resilience than widely appreciated in the human-built world, precisely because there's a lot of maintenance and repair that's largely invisible, but keeps things up and running.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I think I need to go update my operating system. But you have updated our knowledge quite significantly, and I'm going to go download a copy after we get back from lunch. So congratulations on the book, and thanks so much for giving us an opportunity to hear about it from you.
Thank you so much.